After starting this module, you shall be able to learn about the concepts of income consumption curve and Engel curve, the meaning of price consumption curve, the derivation of an individual's demand curve from price consumption curve, substitution effect and income effect, the Giffen paradox, compensated demand curve. In the previous section, we discussed how a consumer maximized his satisfaction by achieving the highest possible indifference curve given his income and goods prices. Now, we shall examine the impact of changes in income and prices on the consumer's equilibrium. This will enable us to derive the Engel curve and demand curve for an individual. We shall also learn to separate the substitution effect and income effect of a change in price.
Now, let us start with an examination of change in income on the consumption and try to derive income consumption curve followed by Engel curve. We will also derive both the curves for an inferior good. First is the income consumption curve. With given money income and prices of two commodities, the consumer will be in equilibrium at the tangency point between the budget line and the highest indifference curve. Now, we will analyze how the situation changes and the consumer attains a new equilibrium when income changes without any change in goods prices. The income consumption curve is the locus of all consumer equilibrium points resulting due to changes in consumers' income only, with prices remaining unchanged.
In the figure, AB indicates the budget line for a given income level M1 and given prices. The consumer is in equilibrium at point P when indifference curve IC1 is tangent to the budget line AB. At P, the consumer purchases OX1 of commodity X and OY1 of commodity Y. Now, suppose the income of the consumer increases from M1 to M2. With this increase in income, the consumer will now be able to purchase larger quantities of both the commodities. As a result, the budget line shifts rightward parallel to the original budget line AB. The new budget line representing M2 income level is shown by CD. With the budget line CD, the consumer reaches a new equilibrium Q on the highest possible indifference curve IC2. At Q, the consumer purchases OX2 of commodity X and OY2 of commodity Y. Thus, as a result of increase in income, the consumer purchases more of both the commodities. At the higher indifference curve IC2, the consumer satisfaction increases so that he is better off at Q as compared to P. If his income increases further to M3 so that the budget line shifts to EF, the consumer reaches the indifference curve IC3 at point R and purchases greater quantities of both the commodities. If the successive consumer equilibrium points like P, Q and R corresponding to various levels of income are connected together, we obtain the income consumption curve, that is ICC.
The income consumption curve is thus the locus of the consumer's equilibrium points corresponding to different levels of consumers' income. The income consumption curve can be used to derive the relationship between a consumer's income and the quantity of goods purchased. The Engel curve shows the relationship between the consumer's level of income and quantity purchased of a commodity, other factors remaining constant.
To derive the Engel curve from income consumption curve, let us measure income levels on the vertical axis and quantity of a good purchased on the horizontal axis as in the lower panel of the figure. The income consumption curve in the top panel of figure shows the equilibrium quantity of X and Y purchased as the income level changes. The parallel budget lines AB, CD and EF corresponds to M1, M2 and M3 level of income respectively, prices remaining constant. Each point of the ICC corresponds to a particular level of income and to a particular quantity of X and Y. The various combinations of the income level and the quantity purchased of good X, that is M1 OX1, M2 OX2 and M3 OX3 are plotted in the lower panel to obtain the Engel curve for good X. The income quantity combinations M1 OX1, M2 OX2 and M3 OX3 shown by point P dash, Q dash and R dash in the lower panel of the figure correspond to the consumer's equilibrium points P, Q and R respectively in the top panel of the figure.
In case of a normal good, the consumer purchases more of it when his income increases. But an inferior good is a type of good which the consumer purchases less of when his income increases. Figure shows the income consumption curve and Engel curve when X is a normal good. We get a positively sloped Engel curve and income consumption curve for a normal good because the consumer purchases more of X when his income increases.
Now let us assume X is an inferior good. In this case, consumption of the commodity decreases as income increases. So the ICC is backward bending and the Engel curve is negatively sloped, indicating a fall in quantity purchased with an increase in income. The income consumption curve is obtained by joining the different consumer equilibrium points as income increases from M1 to M2. As money income increases, the consumer equilibrium moves from the point P on I1 to point Q on a higher indifference curve I2. At the new equilibrium Q, the consumer purchases less of commodity X, which is an inferior good, and more of commodity Y, which is a normal good. This generates a negatively sloped income consumption curve PQ. The corresponding Engel curve is derived in the lower panel of the figure. We obtain a negatively sloped Engel curve since an increase in income leads to a decline in quantity purchased of the inferior good X.
Having discussed the effect of change in income on the consumer, let us now understand the effects of change in prices of the good and derive price consumption curve followed by individual demand curve. Like income, changes in commodity prices also affect consumer behavior. A change in the price of a commodity changes the budget line of the consumer and therefore the quantity of goods purchased by him also changes. We shall now explain how the consumer reaches a new equilibrium when the price of a good changes but his income, taste and prices of other goods remain unchanged. The price consumption curve for good X is the locus of consumer equilibrium points resulting only from changes in the price of a single good, say good X.
In figure, PQ indicates the budget line for a given income level M1 and given prices of commodities X and Y. The consumer is in equilibrium at point A when the indifference curve IC1 is tangent to the budget line PQ. At A, the consumer purchases OX1 of commodity X and O by 1 of commodity Y. Now, suppose the price of good X falls, ceteris paribus, that is, income and price of the other commodity remaining constant. As a result, the budget line swells from PQ to PR. The consumer moves to a new equilibrium B on a higher indifference curve IC2. Ceteris paribus, if the price of X falls further, the budget line rotates further to PS and the consumer reaches a new equilibrium C on indifference curve IC3, joining all the successive consumer equilibrium points like A, B and C at various price levels of good X. We get what is called price consumption curve PCC for good X. Price consumption curve for good X is thus the locus of consumers' equilibrium points resulting from changes in the price of good X.
The demand curve for a good shows the quantity demanded of that good at various prices of the good, with income, taste, and preferences and prices of other goods being held constant. The price consumption curve gives us the change in quantity demanded when price of a good changes, but it does not directly relate the goods price with quantity demanded. The demand curve of an individual shows that the relationship between price and quantity demanded can be easily derived from the price consumption curve as shown in the lower panel of figure.
The horizontal axis in the lower panel of the figure measures quantity of good X as in the top panel, but the vertical axis measures the price of commodity X. Consider the equilibrium point A on the budget line PQ where the quantity demanded of X is OX1. The price of X for the budget line PQ is given by the slope of the budget line. The point A dash in the lower panel directly relates the quantity demanded of X at A to the price level of X corresponding to the budget line PQ. Similarly, points B dash and C dash show the quantity of X demanded at the equilibrium points B and C in the top panel and the price levels of X corresponding to the budget lines PR and PS respectively. The demand curve for good X is obtained by joining the points like A dash, B dash and C dash.
Thus, an individual's demand curve for a good showing how much of the good a consumer will demand at different prices is derived from the price consumption curve with income, taste, and preferences and prices of other goods remaining constant. You may note that the market demand for good X can be derived by horizontally summing across individual demand curves. The sum total of demand by all consumers at each price gives the market demand for good X. We have just seen in the previous sections that a fall in the price of a good normally results in an increase in quantity purchased. This total effect of a price change can be separated into two components called the substitution effect and the income effect. These arise owing to the fact that a change in the price of a good ceteris paribus has two effects. It changes the relative price of goods and it also changes the real income of the consumer. The substitution effect measures the change in consumption of a good as a result of change in relative prices alone, holding real income constant. On the other hand, the income effect measures the change in quantity demanded of a good as a result of change in his real income only. Let us consider a decrease in the price of good X. When the price of a good declines, the real income of the consumer increases. To find out the substitution effect of this price change and separate it from the income effect, the consumer's money income must be reduced so as to exactly offset the gain in real income due to a fall in prices. In case of the Hicksian substitution effect, the price change is accompanied by a change in money income such that the consumer is neither better off nor worse off than before in terms of utility. Thus, the consumer will remain on the same indifference curve even after the change in price. The amount by which the money income is changed to bring the consumer back to the original indifference curve is called compensating variation. In other words, the compensating variation is used to compensate the consumer for a change in price so that the consumer's satisfaction remains same.
The substitution and income effect of a price change is illustrated in the figure. With the given money income and prices, the consumer's equilibrium is shown at point A, where the indifference curve IC1 is tangent to the budget line PQ. With a fall in the price of commodity X, ceteris paribus, the budget line swells to PR and the new equilibrium is achieved at point B. This decrease in price of X results in an increase in the real income or purchasing power of the consumer. To isolate the substitution effect, the individual's money income should be reduced sufficiently so as to keep him on the initial indifference curve IC1. To show this, an imaginary budget line P-R- is drawn that is parallel to the budget line PR and lies below as it represents a reduction in income such that it touches the original indifference curve IC1. P represents the compensating variation in income due to a fall in price of X. It is the amount by which income is reduced to offset the gain due to the increase in real income owing to the fall in price, so that the consumer remains on the same indifference curve as before. In this case, the consumer's satisfaction is maximized at point C, where the indifference curve IC1 is tangent to a imaginary line P-R'. The imaginary budget line P-R' reflects the new relative prices of commodities X and Y since it is parallel to the new budget line PR, which was obtained after the fall in price of commodity X. At the point C, the consumer increases the consumption of good X and decreases the consumption of good Y due to the change in relative price of commodities X and Y. The fall in price of X makes it relatively cheaper compared to Y, whose price is unchanged. Thus, point C shows the new consumer's equilibrium when only the relative price of the commodities has changed. So, the movement from point A to point C along the indifference curve IC1 measures the substitution effect. The convexity of the indifference ensures that the decline in relative price of a good always leads to an increase in its quantity demanded due to substitution effect. In the figure, LM represents the substitution effect. Let us now consider the income effect of the price change. The move from point C on IC1 to point B on a higher indifference curve IC2 measures the income effect. The movement from point C to point B does not involve any change in relative price because the imaginary budget line P-R' and actual budget line PR are parallel. Thus, this change in consumer equilibrium from C to B is only due to the change in purchasing power of the consumer owing to increase in real income due to fall in price of X and therefore measures the income effect. If X is a normal good, an increase in purchasing power leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of X. In figure, Mn shows the income effect for a normal good.
For a normal good, the quantity purchased increases when the price falls, both due to the income effect and substitution effect. But in case of inferior goods, the income effect works in opposite direction to the substitution effect. That is, when the price of an inferior good falls, the income effect leads the consumer to reduce the quantity purchased, while the substitution effect leads the consumer to purchase more. Since the substitution effect is generally larger, then the income effect of fall in price leads to an increase in quantity demanded. This results in a downward sloping demand curve in most cases, even for inferior goods.
The income effect and substitution effect for an inferior good are shown in the figure. As before, we consider the case of a fall in price of good X ceteris paribus. It is assumed that X is an inferior good. As discussed above, the movement from A to C along the indifference curve IC1 shows the substitution effect, and the movement from C to B on a higher indifference curve IC2 shows the income effect of a fall in price of X. In this case, the substitution effect LM is opposite in sign and greater in magnitude compared to the income effect MN, so that the total price effect is positive. As price of good X falls owing to the substitution effect, quantity demanded increases by LM, whereas owing to the income effect, quantity demanded is reduced by Mn, but Lm is greater than Mn. Thus, when the price of an inferior good decreases, the quantity purchased increases, as substitution effect is greater than the income effect, satisfying the law of demand.
Note that in certain cases, it is also possible that the substitution effect is weaker than the income effect when the price of an inferior good declines. In this case, the quantity demanded of the good will decrease when its price decreases, and quantity demanded will increase when its price increases. In this special case, we will get a positively sloped demand curve, and such an inferior good is referred to as a Giffen good or Giffen paradox, named after the British economist and statistician Robert Giffen. You should note that all Giffen goods are inferior goods, but not all inferior goods are Giffen goods.
Figure shows that the income effect and substitution effect for a Giffen good. It is assumed that X is a Giffen good, and as before ceteris paribus, we consider the case of a fall in the price of good X. The movement from A to C along the indifference curve IC1 shows the substitution effect, and the movement from C to B on a higher indifference curve IC2 shows the income effect of a fall in price of the Giffen good X. In this case, the substitution effect is opposite in sign and smaller in magnitude as compared to the income effect. As price of good X falls owing to the substitution effect, quantity demanded increases by Lm, whereas owing to the income effect, quantity demanded is reduced by Mn, but Lm is less than Mn. Therefore, the total price effect shows a reduction in quantity consumed with a fall in price of the good, ceteris paribus. Thus, when the price of a Giffen good decreases, the quantity demanded also decreases, representing an exception to the law of demand.
In previous section, we discussed the derivation of ordinary demand curve for an individual consumer from the price consumption curve. We saw that the individual's demand curve includes both the income effect and substitution effect of the price change. As the consumer moves downward along the ordinary demand curve, his purchasing power increases and he moves to a higher indifference curve, attaining higher level of satisfaction. The increase in real income or purchasing power of the consumer results from the fall in price of the commodity, since the money income is kept constant. But sometimes we are more interested in studying the change in quantity demanded when real income is held constant rather than money income being held constant. Such a demand curve, which shows the effect of a price change on quantity demanded holding real income constant, is called a compensated demand curve. For derivation of compensated demand curve, only the substitution effect of the price change is considered. Thus, whereas the ordinary demand curve includes both the income effect and the substitution effect of a change in price of the good, the compensated demand curve shows only the substitution effect. It follows that for a normal good, the compensated demand curve will be steeper than the ordinary demand curve.
In this module, we have learned the income consumption curve is the locus of consumer equilibrium points resulting only due to changes in the consumer's income ceteris paribus. The Engel curve shows the relationship between level of income and the quantity purchased of a commodity. Other factors, example prices, taste and preferences etc. remaining constant. Inferior good is a type of good of which the consumer purchases less when income increases. The price consumption curve for good X is the locus of consumer equilibrium points resulting only from change in the price of good X ceteris paribus. The total effect of a price change on quantity demanded can be separated into two components called the substitution effect and the income effect. Substitution effect measures the change in consumption of a good as a result of change in relative prices alone, real income remaining constant. The income effect measures the change in quantity demanded of a good as a result of change in his real income only, holding relative prices unchanged. The amount by which the money income is changed to bring the consumer back to the original indifference curve after change in price of a good is called compensating variation. In case of inferior goods, the income effect works in opposite direction to the substitution effect. In case of Giffen good, the quantity demanded of the good decreases when its price decreases and the quantity demanded increases when its price increases. The demand curve is positively sloped for a Giffen good. All Giffen good are inferior good, but not all inferior goods are Giffen goods. Compensated demand curve shows the effect of a price change on quantity demanded. I repeat, on quantity demanded, holding real income constant.